burned with strength and pride. When the cowboy cut her ropes, he expected fear, anger, or silence, but instead she held his wrist and looked straight into his eyes with a calm that felt heavier than any weapon. In a low but steady voice, she spoke words no man had ever said to him before, telling him he would be her husband. The cowboy froze as the desert wind howled around them, because he knew those words carried deep meaning in her world. In that moment, he realized this was not gratitude or madness, but a sacred promise that could either save them both or destroy everything he believed about freedom, love, and survival on the frontier. The cowboy had chosen a life of silence, riding across empty land where no one asked his name and no one cared about his past. He lived in a small cabin far from towns, far from laws, and far from people who could hurt him again. On the wild frontier, he was known as a man who avoided fights, avoided friendships, and trusted only his horse and his rifle. He spoke little, listened carefully, and never stayed in one place longer than necessary. Trouble followed many men in the West, but he walked the long way around it, carrying scars that no one could see. Every sunset found him alone, cooking simple meals by the fire, staring into the flames as memories refused to leave him. He believed solitude was safety and distance was strength. Yet deep inside, a quiet loneliness grew stronger each night, waiting for a moment powerful enough to break the walls he had built around his heart. As the night settled over the desert, the cowboy guided his horse through a narrow canyon, believing he would spend another quiet evening alone. But suddenly a sharp sound cut through the wind and made him pull the reins tight. It was not an animal and not the howl of the desert, but a human cry filled with pain and fear, echoing off the stone walls and fading as quickly as it appeared. He stayed still, listening, his heart pounding because sounds like that often led to danger, ambush, or regret. He told himself to ride away, reminding his mind of all the times curiosity had brought men to early graves, yet his body refused to move. Another cry followed, weaker this time, as if the desert itself was swallowing it, and something deep inside him twisted with a feeling he had tried to bury for years. Slowly, he dismounted and moved forward on foot, every step careful, every breath controlled, as memories of violence and loss whispered warnings in his head. The moonlight revealed broken rocks, dragged marks in the sand, and signs of struggle that made his chest tighten with dread. The wind carried the smell of blood, fresh and sharp, telling him someone nearby was badly hurt and running out of time. His hand hovered near his weapon, not from anger but from fear of what he might find, because the frontier was cruel to the weak and merciless to the kind. As he followed the sound, his thoughts battled each other, one side begging him to turn back and protect the lonely life he understood, while the other pushed him forward toward a fate he could not yet see. When he finally reached a shadowed corner of the canyon, the cries stopped completely, leaving only silence that felt heavier than noise. For a moment, he feared he was too late, and that thought struck him harder than he expected, forcing him to confront the truth that his heart was not as empty as he pretended. He stepped closer, scanning the ground, his pulse racing as the desert seemed to watch him, judging whether he would walk away like so many others or face whatever waited in the darkness. The wind grew colder, brushing against his skin like a warning, but he moved on, driven by a sense that this night was different from all the others before it. Somewhere ahead, a life hung between hope and death, and without realizing it, the cowboy crossed an invisible line, leaving behind the safety of solitude and stepping into a danger that would reshape everything he believed about survival, mercy, and the cost of listening to a crime meant for no one at all. He rounded the final bend and saw her shape pressed against the rocks, barely moving, almost blending into the shadows as if the desert had already begun to claim her. Thick ropes cut into her wrists, her ankles bound so tightly that dried blood darkened the skin, and deep bruises marked her arms and face, telling a story of cruelty without a single word spoken. The cowboy stopped breathing for a moment, stunned by the sight, because this was not just another body left behind by the frontier. This was a living person still fighting to stay in the world. Her chest rose slowly, painfully, and a faint sound escaped her lips, not loud enough to be called a cry anymore, but strong enough to pull him closer despite every warning in his mind. He knelt beside her, noticing the traditional markings on her skin and realizing she was Apache, a truth that tightened his chest with fear and consequence. Helping her could bring warriors down on him before sunrise, yet leaving her there felt like sealing her fate with his own hands. Her eyes fluttered open as his shadow fell across her face, dark with pain but sharp with awareness, watching him as if measuring whether he was another enemy or the last chance she had. He saw no surrender in her gaze, only exhaustion and a quiet strength that refused to break. Carefully, he checked the ropes, feeling anger rise as he saw how roughly they had been tied, how deliberately she had been left where no one was meant to return. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the smell of blood and dust, while his heart hammered with the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew whoever did this wanted her gone, erased without witnesses, and by finding her, he had stepped into a conflict that did not belong to him. Still, his hands moved on their own, gentle but steady, loosening the knots that bit into her skin, because some lines, once crossed, could not be undone. As the pressure eased, she gasped softly, pain flashing across her face, yet she never looked away from him, as if trusting his presence more than her fear. He noticed how thin she was, how the injuries slowed her breathing, and how little time she likely had if he walked away. The silence between them felt heavy, filled with unspoken questions and danger lurking beyond the rocks. When the final rope fell free, she sagged slightly, her strength nearly gone, and in that moment, the cowboy understood she had been abandoned to die, not just by her enemies, but by the world itself. Standing there beneath the cold moon, with an injured woman depending on him and the desert watching in silence, he realized that whatever happened next would follow him for the rest of his life, because some discoveries did not allow a man to return to who he was before. He stayed beside her as the desert wind brushed past them, knowing time was slipping away while his thoughts raced faster than his heart. If he lifted her onto his horse and rode towards safety, every track in the sand would speak for him, leading warriors straight to his door and marking him as a man who interfered in tribal fate. If he walked away, she would not last the night, and the image of her eyes would follow him across every mile of empty land until his last breath. He felt the weight of old choices pressing down, reminding him that solitude had always kept him alive, yet it had also kept him hollow. The woman shifted slightly, a quiet sound escaping her as pain tightened its grip, and that small movement shattered the balance he tried to maintain. He looked around the canyon, reading the land like a map of danger, knowing this place offered no shelter and no mercy. His horse stood nearby, restless, as if sensing the storm that had already begun inside him. He thought of the life he had built by staying uninvolved, by never choosing sides, by believing survival mattered more than meaning. Yet standing there, he realized survival without purpose had slowly turned into another kind of death. The desert did not judge him, but his own silence did. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, feeling her tense before slowly accepting the warmth, a fragile trust forming without words. That simple act made the choice real, because once kindness was given, it could not be taken back. He listened carefully, expecting the sound of approaching riders, imagining arrows cutting through the dark, imagining fire and loss following him home. Fear clawed at him, not of dying, but of causing harm by doing what felt right. He lifted her gently, surprised by how light she felt, as if hardship had already taken so much from her. The effort sent a sharp reminder through his body that this path would demand strength he no longer believed he had. As he placed her on the horse, he knew there was no clean ending waiting, only consequences shaped by courage or regret. The canyon seemed to close behind them, sealing the decision like a vow carved into stone. With one last look at the place where she had been left to disappear, he mounted up, guiding the reins with care, choosing motion over doubt. Every step forward pulled him farther from the quiet life he understood and deeper into a future shaped by danger, responsibility, and an injured woman whose survival now rested entirely in his hands. In that moment, he accepted that war or peace no longer mattered as much as the simple truth that walking away would have destroyed him long before any enemy ever could. He moved with quiet focus, letting actions speak where words would only add fear, drawing his blade carefully and slicing away the remaining fibers that still clung to her skin as if the night itself refused to release her. Each cut was slow and controlled, mindful of how fragile she had become, and when the last restraint fell away, he paused to let her breathe through the pain instead of rushing her into more suffering. He reached for his canteen and tipped it gently to her lips, allowing only small drops at a time, watching relief soften her expression as life slowly returned to her eyes. She drank without protest, trusting his steady hands even though she had every reason not to trust anyone at all. When her strength faltered, he supported her weight without hesitation, lifting her with care that surprised even him, as if protecting her body also protected something broken inside himself. The horse shifted beneath the added burden, but he calmed it with a touch and a whisper, creating a fragile bubble of peace in a place ruled by cruelty. He adjusted her position so she would not fall, securing her balance before mounting behind her, keeping his movements smooth to avoid reopening wounds that already burned beneath her skin. She leaned slightly against him, not from weakness alone, but from an unspoken acceptance that resistance no longer served her. The canyon stretched ahead, dark and unforgiving, yet he guided them forward with patience, choosing paths that softened the ride and shielded her from sharp jolts. Each step carried them farther from the rocks that nearly became her grave, and with every slow breath she took, he felt the weight of his decision settle into something steady rather than heavy. The silence between them held meaning, filled with shared awareness that mercy had been offered without condition or demand. He listened closely for any sign of pursuit, knowing that compassion often carried a price, but he did not let fear tighten his grip or harden his resolve. The horse's rhythm became a quiet promise of movement, of time still passing, of survival still possible. She remained alert despite exhaustion, eyes scanning the darkness with a calm that spoke of resilience shaped by loss, and he respected that strength by giving her space rather than pity. As they rode deeper into the night, the desert no longer felt empty but watchful, as if bearing witness to a choice that could not be undone. He did not speak, because mercy did not require explanation, and she did not ask, because trust sometimes began in silence. Together they moved forward, two strangers bound by a single act that defied fear, tradition, and instinct, carrying with them the fragile hope that kindness given without words could still change the path of both their lives. The horse moved steadily through the open land, its slow rhythm matching the careful balance between distance and trust that grew with every mile, while she remained quiet, her senses sharp despite the pain that still lived in her body. She watched the cowboy from the corner of her eye, studying the way he guided the reins, how his posture stayed alert but not aggressive, how his hands never tightened in anger or impatience. Every motion told her something, and she measured each detail against memories of men who had hurt her before. He did not speak, and that silence unsettled her more than harsh words would have, because it left space for intention to reveal itself without disguise. She noticed how he chose smoother ground instead of speed, how he slowed whenever her breathing changed, how he paused to listen to the night as if danger could rise from any direction. The desert stretched endlessly around them, moonlight painting long shadows that hid both threat and escape, and she knew that if he wished to harm her, there would be no witness and no consequence. That truth made her grip the edge of the saddle tighter, ready for betrayal even as exhaustion pulled at her strength. Yet minute after minute passed, and nothing changed except the distance between them and the place she had nearly died. The cowboy remained focused on the path ahead, never turning to stare, never demanding answers, never treating her like a burden or a prize. That restraint confused her, because mercy without expectation was unfamiliar and dangerous in its own way. She tested him with silence, with subtle shifts of weight, with guarded glances meant to provoke a reaction, but he offered none, staying steady like the land itself. The night air grew colder, and without looking back, he adjusted his coat around her shoulders again, a small movement that carried no claim of ownership, only awareness. That gesture stirred something deep inside her, a memory of care that had nothing to do with control. Still, she did not lower her guard, because survival had taught her that kindness could turn without warning. Her mind raced through possible endings, imagining rescue, capture, escape, or death, yet none of them felt certain anymore. The farther they traveled, the more she sensed that he was not guiding her toward a trap, but away from one, and that realization frightened her more than violence ever had. Trust meant risk, and risk meant pain. She lifted her gaze to the stars, grounding herself in the silence of the sky, while her thoughts wrestled with instinct and hope. Behind her, the cowboy stayed quiet, carrying the weight of her presence without complaint, as if this journey was not an interruption of his life, but a part of it he had been moving toward without knowing. In that shared silence, neither enemy nor savior was confirmed, yet something fragile began to form, shaped by watchful eyes, unspoken choices, and a road that refused to lead back to who either of them had been before. They stopped when the night grew too heavy to travel further, and as the fire settled into a steady glow, she finally broke the silence, her voice low and controlled as if each word had to pass through memory before reaching the air. She spoke without drama, yet every sentence carried weight, explaining how trust once guided her steps and how that trust had been used against her. She told him about a journey meant to bring peace that ended in deception, about familiar faces that turned away when danger appeared, and about hands that seized her while promises collapsed around her. The firelight reflected in her eyes as she described being taken far from her people, not with chaos, but with cruel patience, as if her captors believed time itself would erase who she was. She shared how days blurred together, how strength became a quiet decision repeated with each breath, and how hope survived by shrinking into something small enough to protect. When she spoke of her family, her voice slowed, not from weakness but from respect, recalling laughter carried by wind, lessons learned by watching rather than hearing, and bonds that did not need words to remain strong. She did not describe endings, only absence, letting the silence explain what could not be repaired. The cowboy listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the fire, absorbing her story without judgment or disbelief, understanding that listening was the only gift he could offer. He noticed how she held herself steady while speaking, how pain did not bend her posture, and how resilience shaped every pause. When her voice finally faltered, it was not from fear, but from the effort of carrying loss without letting it define her. The fire crackled softly, filling the space between them with warmth that felt earned rather than borrowed. She admitted that being left behind had not been the worst part, but realizing that survival would mean living with memory had nearly broken her resolve. The cowboy felt a shift inside himself as her words settled, recognizing a familiar ache in a story that did not mirror his own, yet touched the same place. He did not respond with comfort or promises, knowing those would sound empty beside truth, but his presence remained steady, offering proof that her story mattered because it had been heard. She watched his reaction carefully, seeing not pity but understanding, and that difference eased a tightness she had carried since the first betrayal. The night stretched around them, quiet and vast, and for the first time since her capture, she felt the weight of her past rest without pressing her into the ground. When the fire burned lower, her voice softened, and she ended not with despair but with resolve, making it clear that loss had taken much, but not her will. In that shared circle of light, two lives shaped by distance and endurance touched briefly, bound not by rescue or debt, but by the simple act of truth spoken and received without turning away. The fire faded into glowing embers as he remained seated across from her, his posture relaxed yet attentive, showing through stillness that her words had not fallen into empty space. He did not question her choices or doubt her memories, and that restraint spoke louder than reassurance ever could. Instead, he tended the fire, adjusted the blankets, and checked the surroundings with quiet care, making sure safety existed before sleep attempted to claim them. When she shifted from pain, he noticed instantly and offered support without touching where it would hurt, reading her needs as if patience had taught him how to listen beyond sound. The night deepened, and distant noises moved across the land, but he positioned himself where any threat would reach him first, a silent promise shaped by action rather than speech. She watched how he measured the dark, how his focus stayed outward while her presence remained protected within the circle of light. There was no hunger in his gaze, no calculation, no demand for gratitude, only a steady sense of responsibility that did not ask permission. When the cold pressed closer, he placed another layer near her without crossing the space she guarded, giving warmth while honoring distance. She noticed how he slept lightly, rising at the smallest sound, choosing discomfort so she could rest, and that choice unsettled her more than danger had. Cruel men took without noticing, This man noticed everything and took nothing. As hours passed, his past surfaced in small gestures rather than stories, revealed through scars he never explained and habits shaped by long roads and longer nights. He cleaned a shallow cut on her arm with careful hands, waiting for her nod before continuing, allowing control to remain hers. That moment shifted something fragile, because fear loosens when choice returns. He never spoke of rescue or debt, never placed himself above her survival, and that equality steadied her breath. The desert seemed to lean closer, listening, while stars traced paths overhead that mirrored journeys neither of them had planned. When sleep finally reached her, it arrived gently, unforced, carried by the certainty that harm was not waiting beside her. He remained awake, eyes scanning the horizon, accepting the quiet burden of vigilance as if it were a natural duty rather than a sacrifice. In that watchfulness, his hidden heart became visible, shaped by restraint, respect, and a refusal to become what the frontier rewarded. She sensed it even in rest, the way trust forms not through words, but through time kept without breaking. Morning edged closer, and with it the knowledge that daylight would bring consequences, yet he did not retreat from what he had chosen. The man she feared faded into something unfamiliar, replaced by a presence grounded in mercy that asked nothing in return. Without declaring himself kind, he proved it repeatedly, and in doing so, he allowed her to see him not as a threat to endure, but as a human being capable of standing between her and the world without claiming ownership of her fate. The first light of dawn crept over the canyon, spilling golden hues across the rugged landscape. And as the cowboy adjusted the saddle and guided the horse along the rocky path, something subtle began to change between them. The Apache woman had grown quiet after the fire, her eyes no longer scanning for enemies at every turn, but instead studying him with a cautious curiosity, measuring the steadiness in his hands, the calm in his movements, and the absence of threat in every gesture. Each small act he performed, fetching water, adjusting her coat, clearing the path of loose stones, spoke louder than any words could, creating a language built on care and attention. She responded in small ways, leaning slightly when the horse jolted, relaxing her grip as she felt him support her, and offering faint nods or glances that acknowledged understanding rather than obedience. Fear, once sharp and constant, began to dull, replaced by a tentative hope that not all men were instruments of betrayal. The desert around them remained indifferent, its vast expanse carrying dangers unseen, yet within the rhythm of riding together, an unspoken connection formed, a fragile bridge between two lives shaped by hardship and loss. They moved in harmony, he listening to the subtle shifts in her weight, she learning to trust that his presence did not demand control, and in that quiet synchronization, a bond began to root itself, tentative but real. Memories of pain lingered in both, but the shared silence became a canvas where trust painted its first strokes, fragile lines that hinted at something stronger than either had imagined possible. She remembered the nights of betrayal and captivity, and yet here, guided by his calm and protective hands, she felt a thread of safety weaving through her panic. He, too, felt it, a sense of purpose beyond survival, the knowledge that extending mercy and attention could create meaning where solitude had only offered emptiness. Every mile traveled reinforced the silent agreement: protection, respect, and patience without expectation. The horse's steady rhythm became a heartbeat echoing their shared endurance, carrying them over ridges and through shadows where fear once ruled, allowing space for empathy to emerge organically. Occasional glances were exchanged, subtle acknowledgments of presence and gratitude, unspoken but deeply understood, while the wind carried the scent of the desert and the faint smoke of distant fires, framing the journey with natural grandeur and risk. As the morning grew stronger, so did their awareness of one another, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two individuals bound momentarily by circumstance and choice, discovering that kindness, when consistent and free of demand, could heal wounds left invisible for years. In that quiet progress, trust solidified into a bond neither could ignore, a connection powerful enough to quiet fear, steady hearts, and illuminate the beginning of something neither had expected on a path so harsh and unyielding. The distant sound of hooves and shouts shattered the fragile calm of the morning, and the cowboy froze instantly, his senses sharpening as the figures of Apache warriors emerged across the ridges, their movements precise and purposeful, carrying the weight of justice and anger. The woman stiffened behind him, fear flashing in her eyes as she instinctively tried to shrink into the small space the horse offered, her heart racing with memories of betrayal and captivity. He felt the tension coil in the air, the invisible line between mercy and consequence stretching taut, and yet he did not flinch, nor did he try to flee, because running would only confirm fear and invite chaos. Every muscle in his body readied itself, but his calm focus was his weapon as much as his rifle, positioning the horse and himself to shield her without aggression unless forced. The warriors slowed as they neared, scanning the landscape with an intensity that left no room for mistake, and the woman sensed their judgment weighing against him, wondering if the act of saving her had marked him for death. The cowboy's eyes met hers, steady and unshaken, conveying that whatever came, he would stand between her and harm, an unspoken promise stronger than any words could make. The ground seemed to hold its breath as the warriors drew closer, their expressions unreadable yet sharp with authority, and for a moment, time felt suspended, each heartbeat amplified against the vast canyon walls. She realized that her own fear had been a shield, keeping her distant from the reality that he was more than a man who had rescued her. He was a choice, a protector, and possibly the only ally she had in this moment of judgment. The first warrior stopped at a ridge, raising his arm to signal the others, and silence fell heavier than the sounds of hooves and wind had ever been. The cowboy shifted slightly, making a subtle adjustment to keep her safer while showing no intent to provoke, allowing patience and restraint to speak louder than challenge. Her hands tightened slightly on the reins, and he noticed but said nothing, letting her feel the power of trust without interference. As the warriors assessed him, their eyes tracing the lines of his face and the quiet discipline in his stance, the woman realized that he was not a threat to them, but neither was he weak, and that balance of mercy and strength might be the key to surviving this encounter. Every second stretched longer, filled with suspense, the desert holding its breath as if knowing the outcome would echo across miles of land. The first warrior finally spoke, his voice measured, neither angry nor welcoming, yet commanding attention, and the cowboy remained still, allowing actions to define him rather than words. In that fragile moment, the truth of who he was, the courage, the restraint, and the integrity revealed by simple acts of mercy, became visible, and the woman felt a flicker of hope that the danger looming over them might be met with respect rather than violence. A realization powerful enough to steady her racing heart as the warrior's judgment and the cowboy's resolve faced each other across the canyon floor. She drew a deep, steadying breath, feeling the weight of every eye upon her as the Apache warriors circled closer, the tension in the air so thick it seemed to press against her chest. And yet in that silence, she found a courage born of desperation and gratitude, a boldness that came not from recklessness, but from the certainty that this man beside her had risked everything to save her life. Without hesitation, she lifted her chin and stepped forward, her small frame poised with an inner strength that startled even herself. And in a voice clear and unwavering, she declared before the tribe that the cowboy was her chosen husband, her protector, and her companion in the face of danger. The canyon echoed with her words, carrying them far enough to reach every rider, every discerning eye, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the reaction that could either bring violence or acceptance. The cowboy remained still, silent, his expression unreadable, yet every line of his body relaxed slightly, as if relief mingled with pride, knowing she had acted from her own free will and not under coercion, and that truth lent weight to her declaration. The warriors froze, their gazes flicking between the woman and the man, searching for signs of deceit, hesitation, or insult, but finding none. The realization dawned that her choice was deliberate, unshakable, and commanding respect rather than submission. Her heart pounded fiercely, the memory of captivity and betrayal flashing sharply. Yet she felt an unspoken reassurance in the man beside her, a presence that had never demanded more than his courage and had given her the freedom to speak. The eldest warrior stepped forward, eyes narrowing, measuring the bond she had just forged against the customs and expectations of their people, and the silence stretched, thick with judgment and anticipation, while she stood firm, unyielding, yet not confrontational, embodying the balance between honor and defiance. The others watched, their postures tense, waiting for any sign that her words were reckless, and she could feel the weight of every moment shaping the potential outcome of not just her fate, but his as well. The cowboy shifted slightly, allowing her declaration to stand unchallenged, his restraint reinforcing her courage rather than overshadowing it. And the air seemed to hum with the recognition that mercy, trust, and bravery could alter the course of ancient customs without breaking them. She realized that by speaking first, by claiming a choice that neither fear nor obligation dictated, she had seized control of the moment, placing both herself and the man who had saved her into a fragile alliance that demanded acknowledgement. The sun rose higher, illuminating the rugged faces of the warriors, and gradually, tension began to transform into understanding, as her boldness communicated the respect and sincerity that words alone could not convey. In that single act, she not only protected him but also shaped the outcome of the confrontation, binding them together with a declaration that carried authority, courage, and the unspoken promise of shared survival and loyalty, a choice that would resonate far beyond the canyon in which it had been spoken. The warrior's eyes swept over him, scanning every line of his posture, every detail in the way he held himself, looking not for words or excuses, but for the quiet truth that actions revealed. And in that long, stretched silence, the weight of judgment pressed against both the cowboy and the woman who had spoken for him, her small figure standing firm beside the horse as though her courage could influence the outcome of their verdict. Each rider shifted slightly, the soft creak of leather and the distant sound of hooves on stone punctuating the tension, yet none made a move to attack or challenge, because what they saw defied expectation. He had not come with arrogance, deceit, or threat, only with a steadfast restraint and an evident willingness to protect someone not of his own people. The woman held her breath as the eldest among them leaned forward, reading the man's body language, the way his eyes followed danger without panicking, the way his hands had tended her wounds earlier with care that demanded no repayment. Slowly, nods began, subtle but deliberate, spreading like ripples across the group as the realization sank in that he had earned respect not through weapons or promises, but through mercy, an unfamiliar language for their tribe, yet one they recognized instantly, because they understood strength balanced with compassion. The silence deepened, no longer oppressive but contemplative, each warrior weighing past grievances against present deeds, each measuring honor not in conquest, but in the courage to act rightly when no obligation forced him to do so. The woman's pulse slowed slightly, hope threading through her veins as she sensed that their acknowledgement of him was not conditional on her words, but on the undeniable truth etched in his behavior, a truth that transcended tribe, custom, and expectation. The cowboy remained composed, aware of their scrutiny yet unflinching, allowing patience and consistency to speak for him as he shifted slightly to shield her from any sudden threat, a simple gesture that conveyed volumes about the character he refused to declare aloud. The younger warriors exchanged glances, understanding without words that this was not a man to challenge lightly, and even the stoic elders allowed the edges of approval to show in subtle nods and softened stances, the tension easing just enough to signal that the encounter might end without bloodshed. The woman felt the enormity of the moment press down on her, realizing that her declaration had been powerful, but that the cowboy's restraint and empathy had sealed its effect, turning potential hostility into cautious acceptance. Time stretched as recognition spread, the harsh desert wind softened by an unspoken consensus that actions born of kindness carried authority greater than threats or rage, and in that moment, the canyon held a rare peace as the tribe's judgment shifted from suspicion to respect. The cowboy finally exhaled, a quiet release almost unnoticed by anyone but the woman, who felt the connection between them deepen as the danger receded not through force or clever words, but through the undeniable power of mercy, trust, and the courage to act without expectation, a lesson written silently across the faces of those who had come to judge, yet found themselves witnesses to a truth far greater than confrontation. Slowly, deliberately, the warriors lowered their weapons, the harsh metal and pointed tips retreating from tension into acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement that the bond between the cowboy and the Apache woman was neither demanded nor artificial, but born from courage, compassion, and actions that spoke louder than any declaration or claim of authority. The woman exhaled softly, feeling the tight coil of fear unwind from her chest as the first hints of relief passed through the group, and the cowboy remained steady on his horse, alert but unthreatened, allowing the gestures of respect to settle naturally without assertion or pride. Every rider adjusted their posture, letting the weight of judgment ease, and even the elders, whose eyes carried decades of experience and vigilance, allowed themselves a subtle nod, signaling that honor had been recognized not through force, battle, or coercion, but through consistent, deliberate protection of life in the face of danger. The woman's gaze met the cowboy's briefly, a silent understanding passing between them that their trust, forged in the crucible of peril and hardship, had been validated in a way that could not be undone or questioned. The wind swept softly across the canyon, carrying dust and echoes of the desert, and the landscape itself seemed to exhale, releasing the tension that had wrapped the moment in suspense and fear. She felt her pulse slow, her hands relaxing as she leaned slightly against the horse, knowing that the choice she had made to speak boldly, to claim him as her partner in this precarious moment, had not only shielded him, but had also transformed potential conflict into acknowledgement. The cowboy adjusted his position, allowing the woman to feel her strength and voice had mattered, that her actions had shaped the outcome, and in doing so, he reinforced the respect that had been earned without demanding compliance or gratitude. Around them, the warriors exchanged glances, some speaking softly to one another in a language she could not fully grasp, yet the tone carried reverence, caution, and approval, a tacit agreement that a man's character could outweigh prejudice and fear. The horse shifted beneath them, sensing the change in energy, its muscles relaxing as the danger of confrontation faded, and the canyon, once tense and echoing with threat, seemed suddenly vast, yet welcoming, as if space itself had recognized the delicate balance of mercy and honor. The cowboy's eyes scanned the horizon, not with suspicion but with careful awareness, demonstrating that vigilance could coexist with compassion, and she felt the quiet power of his presence stabilize the moment even further. Together, they began to move slowly, understanding that survival had been secured not through force but through deliberate, principled action, and each step carried the weight of a lesson neither words nor history could easily erase. The morning light strengthened, illuminating dust motes that danced around them like witnesses to the resolution, and in that shared space, a bond formed that was deeper than fear, stronger than circumstance, and more enduring than any expectation of reward, a connection built entirely on courage, kindness, and the mutual recognition of integrity in a harsh and unforgiving land. The cowboy walked forward, the weight of the desert behind him and the promise of a new life ahead, carrying not just the woman he had saved, but the understanding that true strength came from mercy, courage, and the quiet choice to protect rather than dominate. She walked beside him, her eyes reflecting relief, gratitude, and a fierce spark that had survived betrayal, captivity, and loss, now shining brighter because she had chosen to trust. The canyon, once echoing with cries of fear and judgment, now seemed alive with possibility, every shadow softened by the dawn and every wind whispering of hope. Together, they moved as equals, each step a testament to trust earned, respect given, and bonds forged in danger and compassion. The cowboy, once alone and hardened by solitude, felt the warmth of connection, realizing that saving a life had created something far greater than survival. It had created love, honor, and a shared future neither could have imagined, a story destined to linger in the heart long after the desert faded from sight.